the FHIR on the 1st January 2025 call for CA baseline. So if you're listening to the recording, we were just talking about today's last day on the early bird deadline for the January virtual working group meeting. We were talking a little bit about where to go to register, and if you're an HL7 candidate member or you're interested in becoming one, the details associated with doing that. The other things that I had on the agenda for today, I've got because it is profiling, and if you're catching up after the break or from before the break, our big focus is getting the latest V1.2 out the door. So what I've done is kind of organize 3 bullets here. First being like anything that we've basically said is triage. So this is something that we might have like reviewed or discussed slightly in the past, and we think it's probably falls within the scope of potentially 1.2 that we need some decisions on so that we can get those closed out and applied. Throughout the break, huge thanks to Elliot. We were able to get a lot of the things that were ready to be applied in and reviewed and merged. So we took, I think, our ticket count from we had something like 20 outstanding tickets to, I think it might be like 3 that we have the decisions on that just essentially need to be changed. Which puts us in a really good place to be potentially able to get V1.2 out in the next week. And then there's some things that we'll just probably want to just confirm. They're technically in our submitted bucket. I had to look at them today. I think they're probably all 2.0, but just want to make sure folks are aware of them and we're all in agreement that those are ones that we'll save on the log that we don't necessarily need to address before we put out the 1.2 package. In addition to these things, is there anything that we should be prioritizing and that folks want to make sure that we discuss today in the scope of profiling for the baseline? If not, I think we can probably get right into it. So I made just quick mention of this. We're working towards 1.2, knowing that a 2.0 update is forthcoming and that some of our larger changes that we still will have outstanding issues for are intended to go into that. But here's our latest update. So I think we had like 41 prior to the kind of the big break push. Now we only have a total of 10 that are between submitted and triaged. I anticipate really what this means is 5 are going to go into the waiting for community feedback, depending on what you guys think, which would be like things that are going to be reevaluated when we get to 2.0. And realistically, I think we've got 5 in the triage group that we just need to make decisions on, and then that will be keeping, once applied, will allow us to move forward with a 1.2 package, which is fabulous. And we've cleared the log of things that we have decisions on that need to be applied, which is even better. So I thought we might start with the ones that we thought, like squarely, these are things that we need to kind of document a decision and an action forward on. A lot of them are kind of more technical corrections in nature, but we'll review each one together. Before I click into any of these, Elliot, I saw you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just can I make a comment about terminology?
Yeah, absolutely.
So people may or may not be aware that just before Christmas, the InfoWay terminology server got integrated into the FHIR terminology ecosystem, which means that you can use InfoWay terminology through IG Publisher and through the validator. Sheridan, you and I have talked about, we'll do a walkthrough of that at some point on these calls. But an issue came up yesterday that I wanted to raise some awareness of, which is if you're using the InfoWay value sets that were previously available through tx.fhir.org, SCP qual, and there's about 5 of them in there. Those will now cause failures of your build because what's going to happen is the terminology server is going to try and look at InfoWay to get that content. And if you don't have a API key, it's going to fail and say you're not authorized, even though it could get that content from tx.fhir.org if it asked directly. So just if you are using IG Publisher in your own work, this is something you might want to be aware of.
And next steps with that, Elliot, like, is it, the idea is that like, we're still kind of working through and troubleshooting ways that this will kind of make its way into the process, like the improvements to it?
So that particular issue, I think, is a difference of opinion about what the proper behavior is between Graham and I. So I don't know that that one's actually going to change, which is not really an issue for anyone in Canada, but it is an issue if you happen to be using one of those value sets and can't ask InfoA for an API key. So some of our European fellows who might be doing testing of PSCA or something like that, they're going to run into errors and really won't have any idea why. So this is, you know, for Canadians, just go get an API key from InfoA. It's not a hard thing to do. Set it up with your validator, set it up with your IG publisher. And as I said, we'll walk through that at some point on one of these calls. But until then, you know, Jean Duteau yesterday ran into an unexpected error that was due to this.
Okay, so do you think the way I've kind of summarized this is true to form? And I'll put this link into Ken. So basically, you know, it's gone live. As it's going live and it's being used by a much broader set of stakeholders, we're kind of identifying that while, you know, we've talked about this kind of use of the API key, and in future sessions, we will be kind of applying that change in the baseline so folks can kind of see how we do it on our end so they can repeat it. That, you know, if you're operating outside of Canada or you're kind of not a necessarily conventional Canadian implementer, there might be some limitations that we're aware of at the moment.
Yeah, I guess if you're outside of Canada, part of it will depend on how willing InfoA is to provide an API key to someone outside of the country.
Yeah. And I think that you posted in the chat, Ken, is this the request form for the API key?
That's correct.
Okay. All right, anything that we want to add to that?
Sorry, just a little bit details about this API key, and my understanding, Elliot, this is a part of requirements in the contract between the InfoWay with maybe the TX server to have this service being established. That actually, in other words, is really not a really pure free public accessible service from InfoWay side. Is that right?
It is free. The requirement has to do with licensing from SNOMED to ensure that they meet all the usual legalese.
Within Canada as a membership. Yeah, gotcha.
Sounds good. And I think, like I said, like, I know obviously it's still a pretty new process. We're going to walk through it, I'm guessing, in one of the next profile calls as soon as we get 1.2 out the door. It's probably one of those things that we can start putting into our settings and do a recording like we always do. If you're interested in kind of repeating the process on your end, we'll go through kind of end-to-end request for the key and an actual kind of application of it. So I'm excited. Anything else that we want to add to this front or have questions for before we go on to those tickets?
Well, just pop up one solution possible. Elliot, I'm not sure for the TX server, is there any possibility or not today, maybe down the road, they would like to have access points set up in Canada. So, you know, all those API key can be focused on in that specific service endpoint located in Canada and be recognized by this Infoway and open the door. But I'm not sure this is a license there, but, you know, just suddenly pop up in my mind.
Yeah, the licensing issue, I'm not really involved in. That's an Infoway decision. And it's necessary whether you access the terminology server FHIR endpoint through IG Publisher and Validator, which are calling it through tx.fhir.org, or whether you are directly querying it. You'll still need that API key, or you'll need the OAuth token or the other mechanisms that are in place to control the access.
All right.
Thanks.
All right, so we might pause if there are further questions, I think, around the terminology server. My guess is, if I'm looking at like our next couple weeks, so my hope is that we can maybe return, and maybe this is one of the topics that we return to on the 24th following publication of the V1.2 is starting to go through this and having a couple sessions around our configuration and how it works and what that actually ends up producing in terms of an end result with the baseline. So if you don't have questions now, no worries, because we can certainly save them for some of the future sessions where I'm sure we'll know a lot more. All right, in keeping on the agenda, I've got a couple items that I've got in the triage space that we'll jump to first. A few of them are kind of easy. I think I'm gonna maybe start with one of them that is a little bit, since we're in the terminology hat right now. There was one that was interesting that was in the triaged bucket, where effectively we had previously discussed it and said, okay, we think we kind of know some next steps on this, but in evaluating it for application, one of the things that had come up was that we may actually need to stub it out if we're uncomfortable with the way that the codes are displaying today. If that's ultimately, I think it's a decision that we have to make, whether or not that's something that we want to put off and we're comfortable with how things are, or if we want to stub it out ahead of 2.0, knowing that we're already making a number of changes to value sets in 2.0. So I thought we might start with this one because it is a little bit more discussion based and we do need a decision on some of it. There's another terminology here around terminology related one around value set unioning and intersectioning. And it's just some kind of miscellaneous ones. But I'm going to put this one in the link in the chat so that we can follow along together. If anyone's interested in seeing this in the issue log as we walk through it. And I think it's, let me see. I think it's 1642. Yep. Okay. So this was one that seemed really simple in reading through it, and that originally came up and like it was an issue where the link in our actual page in the encounter profile under, it was notes, or I think it might have been under terminology bindings, wasn't rendering. And so like some of that has already been resolved in terms of like this now points to hold on, actually I think it was this encounter, is it encounter type? Yep, encounter type. So it now points to a stub, but it's a partial, like our page for encounter type. And I'll show that here in a second. But that ultimately we had put this note in to say, you know, we have this pointing to a link essentially for the baselines page for the encounter type value set. And normally with a lot of our value sets, we say, okay, basically this is the landing page, and like we'll provide a link to how do you actually access this you know, edits canonical in the terminology gateway and in the future on the terminology server. You know, a while back we had said, makes sense, we'll just make sure that this is that the proper link gets applied. But we had a note on like confirming that the expected values that we would have anticipated are the ones that are showing up under enumeration. And so before I close this out, I started looking into it. And so I'll just show you real quick. We have this profile on with encounter. We've got encounter type here. You can see it points to the, you know, value set encounter type. And then we also have it called out here. If I was to click into any one of these, it'll bring me to the page that gets generated for this value set. And this is just based off of what we've defined here, which has, you know, some text that basically provides information about, you know, what is this value set? And I think it has a link typically, like this would be the description that we previously had within this value set on terminology gateway. Important to note that not all of our value sets do we do this, but in some of them, we also have included this include statement.
Yeah, just before you go too far back along, if you go back to the top of that page where it says this includes values from SNOMED.
This one, right?
Yes, for SNOMED CT, when you're in there fixing things, put an S in descending.
Into sending, oh, here. Okay, so that is one correction, yeah, the more of a typo correction.
Yeah, but I just noticed it and I was gonna lose it if I didn't.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. Remind me when we make the change, if we make, well, remind me here in a second, because we have to make the modification regardless, but okay, so effectively, this was the description, and at the time that we were creating these value sets, we were just taking descriptions from the overview, right? Of an encounter type and putting them in here. And that was kind of our process for steps. You use the canonical of the one that you cared about, you put in the description, and in a handful of places, we had also put in this include statement. And this include statement basically says anything from the concept of 308, that descends from this, right? When it enumerates with any of the value sets that we have made this inclusion statement for, it will pull, you know, and it's not always a fulsome list because sometimes these are giant, but it should pull, I think this one is like 69 concepts that fit with that, anything that is in SNOMED CT International, under that code. And this is valuable. This is super valuable to be able to actually see without having to enumerate this like in the value set itself, what the expanded concepts are that we're talking about. The reason I think that this is important for us to kind of think about as a decision today is that ultimately when we've made this definition like this, it seems to only be pulling what's in SCT, you know, SNOMED info /SCT, and it's not pulling any of the actual SCTCA. Now, I don't know if it's because encounter type code, which is slightly different, but does include the encounter types in them, is, you know, only populated with like, well, I think it's twofold. I don't know if it's that encounter type code isn't the same equivalent that we should be looking at, or if it's a, you know, what we're seeing in terminology gateway for this, these concepts is like purely isolated to the SNOMED CT CA. So I just went ahead before the meeting and I was just like trying to find, you know, what we used to use for encounter type. And these are what I can see right now for subsets. So first things first is I don't believe there's an equivalent this canonical that exists anymore. And so I think we have to decide, do we modify this to encounter type code? Is that what we originally intended? Or like, do we keep the value set definition as it is, but not utilize this particular canonical? Because I think regardless, something has to change. Unless we have insight into that, maybe it's not in subsets, it's in something else, but from what I can see, like this canonical doesn't exist. And I don't believe it unless there's, maybe Ken, can you check on the terminology server side? If there is encounter type without code appended at the end?
Sure, let me take a look. Might be a little bit though.
Okay, I'm pretty sure like there's kind of two steps. One is I think we have to modify the canonical to include code because I'm pretty sure this was, if I look back in old versions, a change where it used to be, let me see. Maybe it wasn't. Looks like the canonical was always the same. So I think we need to make a decision about whether or not essentially this is what we had originally intended. And if so, are we in a bad spot if the Canadian CTCA value set that we're referencing has a different set of codes, only the Canadian ones, than what we're actually seeing in the expansion, which is everything, just only the international ones without the Canadian ones. So two proposed changes would be we change this to encounter type code to align to, I thought, what was supposed to be this equivalent to begin with. And potentially we temporarily remove the inclusion statement here. So that we're just pointing people to the Canadian, the link for the Canadian value set until we get the full pass through to the terminology server, PanCan terminology server in place. What are folks' thoughts on the first piece, which is like there's this kind of floater here and we don't know whether or not this was supposed to be encounter type code and mean the same things as what we have in the terminology gateway for Canada.
Well, my thought might not really directly relevant to this specific question, but really relevant to this the big topic regarding the value set and the system code per se, which is connected to this called canonical URI for this any specific FHIR-based IG here. And if I could be given a couple minutes to think to share my opinion here, but when we talk about a canonical URI for this baseline IG, and it's actually my understanding this more specific to represent the scope and authority of this piece of IG work. And in that manner, and I really appreciate and we talk about the value set stuff, which my understanding is a very valuable component, and I believe it's a contribution of Canada to the maybe think about by the HR7 FHIR international community, because which is this work can be utilized to implement the self-sustainability of each FHIR-based IG as well to hold the HR7 FHIR principle loose coupling, that principle, and hold that principle. And also, as what I observed, and we could provide some materials, details, as example, or maybe called recommendation to the really use case implementer to pursue their to make it based on their decision. And that's why we call the baseline as a use case agnostic project. And we might think if it's not mandatory from the FHIR International, we might think to create our URI and within this canonical URI of a baseline to we call it the value set step to represent all those value sets. In that way, we can, I use the word isolate all those works, which is being out of control of our baseline IG work, and give those freedom to the use case specific implementer, they think they take care about it. We just make our IG system, FHIR, more as a kind of close to more near to closed system, but to not still keep it door open for the future use case development. In that manner, we will save a lot of time to talk about such kind of I might call it out of controlled technical details, which is more and more stretched outside our our IG work. Just stop here.
So contextualizing that, if I were looking at the base resource, encounter type
Just
doesn't have
that's
a.
right. Conceptualize it.
Yep. Sorry, was there someone else? Maybe.
Just conceptualize it or
Yep.
contextualize is okay. Yeah, you're right. Contextualize, conceptualize. Well, I'm more like conceptualize it. You give this one, you give the description, you give a few options, city, link, client, whatever, put it underneath, and also the use case implementer, they can go to a local value set if they would like. But in that manner, we don't worry about it because all those value set and this baseline is with our what we call kinetic URI root, right? Or domain name, as Eddie mentioned, plus protocol component. And then it's totally within our control. So we don't worry about it. If there's this gateway lose access, if that value set lose kind of validation, it's not in our conversation scope anymore.
And I think we're set up well to do that. I think that this one is a little bit stickier because what we basically, the base FHIR spec says, well, I'm giving you an example binding, and that example binding is, it's not even SNOMED, right? It's just for items for that come from this encounter type. What we've done in the baseline is we've said, well, we've created a place where our value sets that we see often used in Canada, that we're preferring, that this can get bound to. And I think the problem was that maybe when we started, we thought, we'll just use this patient encounter procedure as the definition. And I don't know if it was that we thought we were originally aligning to the Canadian SCTCA includes, like, the set of codes that include our additional SCTCA encounter codes. But by kind of having our own value set URL that is independent of the actual one that is hosted on the terminology server or in the terminology gateway, we've kind of orphaned this thing to now just say it's anything, but it's only the codes. We're preferring you only use the codes that come from this in SNOMED International, and we're not actually including any of the codes that have actually been introduced because they are in use in Canada. Like telephone encounter, direct encounter, these are like ones that were introduced with SCTCA. So we have the structure, I think, that you're talking about, but the problem is we might have this challenge in that in our current structure, we're kind of actually, we're not precluding it, but we're not encouraging the use of SCTCA codes that also fall within this space. And so I think what we need to say is for 1.2, do we maintain this? Because that was our intent and it wasn't a mistake. And so we want to like keep this in place and maybe reevaluate in 2.0. Or was it a mistake and our goal was to align to a value set that actually existed at this pan-Canadian level that's available in terminology server?
So my question is our value set a union of the Canadian and the international SNOMED CT codes in those hierarchies?
In this current state, it's not. From a technical perspective, it's not defined that way.
Is that the way we, like, business-wise, is that what we want? We want a value set that includes the international patient encounter procedure codes plus any defined in the Canadian set. Because Elliot knows more about this than me, but would the Canadian set normally be an addition to international, or would it be a total replacement?
The one that,
Like-
the way that this one is defined is it's in addition, like these are just, I think, isolated to.
Yeah, but in addition, meaning you can use these as well as the international, or in addition, meaning that you can just use these and we're replacing the international.
If you just go to this to sample the business case, there's no one universal solution because the interoperability is the goal, is the eventual goal of this work. And as what we said, we all know that from the data structure perspective or data model, data structure, or from the terminology side. So you can see there's a lot of a shift at the different layers. But normally I would say the FHIR data structure will stay as a more stable component. But the terminology side, here we talk about a value set or system, the terminology system side, we'll see quite a lot of shift. For example, if you go COVID-19, right? You got a local code of COVID-19, but if you want to cross travel Canada, you want to have a national recognized COVID-19 code. If you want to travel international, you need to have a WHO recognized code set. So you can see a lot of shift in that.
Yeah, but I'm talking about in this narrow context, Thomas, in this terminology, are we wishing to choose just the Canadian set, or are we wishing to choose the Canadian set plus potentially anything that's in the international? For instance, in a lot of our V3 value sets in lab, we said you use the PLC, PCLOD, the Canadianized LOINC codes, but you can also use the international LOINC codes, particularly if we're talking about something that's not in the Canadian set. Is that the business context we mean here?
I think like I look at these as almost having to be unions because they're different. Like one is, I feel like it's describing, it's a telephone counter, it's an encounter with a consultant, and then what's in the SCT international is like encounter for symptoms. So I don't know, like when I look at these, I don't think that one encompasses the other in either direction. And so we have to decide if we want the combination of them.
Yeah, I think the valid business choices are either the combination or just the Canadian ones, depending upon what it is we want. I suspect what we want is the combination. Because the broadest set.
Differently than that?
Yeah.
That we would have a case for only recommending this one or only recommending that one. Because I think it's a very reasonable point.
I wouldn't want to not include that Canadian set because
doesn't SNOMED CTCA include all of the international as well?
That was part of my question. But this particular value set in subset in terminology gateway doesn't include everything. But if we did the include against the same hierarchy in SNOMED CTCA, that's the question. Would we also get the international codes as well as the Canadian ones? I don't think we want to say we're not using the Canadian ones because looking at these, I suspect they may be in use in existing V3 systems because of the age of the value set that's on the right.
First, I can see there's a possible escalate to the governance call about this one. Maybe I'm wrong because this is still a technical discussion about this specific question, but I can sense. Yeah.
I don't see a governance issue here.
Yeah, and also another side, I would say just specific for this question about they talk about the ECL, I would say I did have a very limited experience to try to use ECL, but in that manner, actually the validation process, it's really how to see that count on the official SNOMED CT like onto server can resolve the issues. Doesn't mean that other a terminology service cannot do the job, but actually the cost is very high. So in that manner, I would say if we still go to this way, I think I can sense we might fall in the same discussion about mass port in that manner.
I'm with Lorraine. I don't know, for this particular ticket, I think we can basically say, well, I think we've got two decisions. One is, do we think we have enough information to do this in 1.2, and is it important in 1.2? Or is this something that we put into a discussion for 2.0? And then the real meat decision is, do we believe that we should include a union with the SNOMED CTCA codes that are involved here? Because they aren't actually enumerating, or they aren't expanding, I'm sorry, in our current, from what's loaded in from terminology, tx.fhir.org for that value set today.
Yeah, so because what gets loaded is usually, particularly for the SNOMED ones, what gets displayed in the page is a subset, like a selection of the codes, because that usually can't expand all the codes. There's usually too many. But I think there's a bit of a general question about when we're adding the include definitions. I was trying to not overload the word include definitions into the JSON definition of the value set, that we make sure we reference both Canadian and, where appropriate, international. We certainly did that a lot in the past in V3, like the example of the lab value sets, including PCL, OCD, plus the international.
Just specific to this, shared in your word, the union that specific of the CT and the CA. Here's my comment or feedback here, based on my very limited knowledge about the SNOMED CT. But there other, terminology expertise in the call can provide more information. Actually, the CT actually is the base, and the CA is actually tailored CT plus some extension. In that manner, if we put a union there, my personal would like to avoid that avenue, because that will mess up quite a lot.
So Thomas, are you saying you'd prefer, if it's
You
going
either
to be
go
a
to
technical
the
definition, that it goes to a terminology, like if there was a value set definition on the PanCan terminology server that contained both the SCTCA added codes plus the SCT ones for this, to not
it's
rely on.
tailored. I'm not 100% guaranteed all those international CT code should be included inside Canadian CA edition, but most of them. Sorry?
We already currently are referencing all of those international codes in the value set we have.
But not union.
Right now, the value set definition is only going to the international.
Mhm.
Yep, that's okay. That's okay.
So I mean, there might be a time when someone wants to put the work to create a specific Canadian reference set or subset, but we haven't done that yet. And by I'm not going. The normal process we've got is, particularly when we don't have a lot of research or experience knowing to narrow a subset down, is that we let the community have access to the full set to use what they need to do. And that's particularly true in the baseline, where we don't know the specific use case. So the broadest sensible value set is what I think meets our general design requirements.
I like you use the word general design requirements. That's why I would say keep it, is not my understanding, keep it as loose as possible, and give it more freedom to the use case implementer to pick up their preferred value set.
So in terms of things that we can change, I'm going to throw something out there as a potential avenue forward. I'm just going to comment this so I don't lose it. if we're worried about defining this value set as a union at this point in time, like not from a business perspective, but from a technical perspective, where we'd be worried about putting the include comment where it's like everything from this plus everything from this value set. We could still indicate that in the description and say, you know, what we're hoping for is from like a human readable perspective, a union of everything under this concept here that includes both, you know, the SCT international codes and the SCTCA added codes, while we work out in in prep for 2.0, how do we express that in a way that's going to work with how things are loaded into the PanCan terminology server and txfhir.org. That's another way that we could go through this challenge if we're not sure what will happen if we make those that union statement on the value set today.
Yeah, and that might, and the question is that a different canonical URL than the one we're expressing at the top of this page?
If
Right.
we make the narrative change, you mean?
Yeah, well, if we make a narrative change to include content that's not formally defined by the canonical URL, I think that might actually cause issues where it's only a narrative change, and we're actually then with narrative changing the intent of what that canonical URL described.
Oh, you mean because it was even though this was 100% ours, like this is never, it looks like it hasn't existed elsewhere, that because we're changing the content underlying, we should like retire the use
Well,
of this to
I
avoid.
mean, the subset changes over time anyhow. You can see that there's multiple versions of this.
Well, I can see that, certainly see changing the subset with the formal definition and saying the new definition of this canonical URL is X.
Yeah.
But trying to do that just in narrative worries
Well,
me.
I think all you would really need to do is say the value set includes content from SNOMED CTCA instead of SNOMED CT. And then you'd get all the Canadian and all the international.
We haven't tested that to know that for sure, but ideally that would be true.
You're saying here, Joni, SNOMED CTCA descending from this concept.
Yeah.
Yeah, and as well as in the formal logical definition.
Yeah.
But
Well,
I don't.
I think even with SNOMED CTCA, it's still that same URL. It's still just SNOMED info SCT. All of SNOMED is under that, regardless of regardless of country versions.
Here, that's what you're saying. Like when we
Yeah.
actually look at the include statement.
Yeah.
Well, right now that include statement, as we're running it, does not give us the items in the expansion on the right-hand part of Sheridan's screen. That's I'm saying in principle, I agree with you, Joni, but I'm saying we'd have to test it to make sure it's actually giving us what we mean.
I have the SNOMED browser open right now. I'm just going to plug in that number. What is that number? 30.
Oh, sorry. 308-335-008.
Patient encounter procedure. It has 30 children, 6 of which are Canadian. And
Okay,
Canadian ones are direct encounter, in-person encounter, direct encounter with client alone, direct encounter with client and third party, direct encounter with client and group, and direct encounter with third party alone.
But there's more than 6 in that right-hand screen.
Right. There's 30 in SNOMED CTCA, 6 of which are Canadian concepts. So how many concepts are in
13.
counter type? 13. So if we were to switch this to an intentional definition that gets everything that is a 308-335-008 from SNOMED CTCA, we would go from 13 to 30.
And I'm going through the shrimp browser. I'm seeing there's a bunch that are under indirect encounter rather than the patient encounter concept.
Could that describe, Ken, the differences between why in Joni's view, she's seeing 30, but in what gets expanded here, we're getting 69,
Could be.
independent of which ones are Canadian?
Yeah, I'm wondering if I've sent us down too detailed a rabbit hole for the call and whether this is something we have to figure out offline or we want to do it here.
Well, I actually think like what maybe this is pointing us in the direction of is there are enough maybe technical risks, potential risks, that it might be worth saying this is one that in addition to the decision about unioning, we need to do testing of, and therefore maybe it's a good 2.0 because we know that there's going to be some overhaul with terminology in 2.0.
Mhm.
Okay, so what I'm putting down, because the underlying
We probably lost Elliot, haven't we?
we have, yeah.
Yeah.
I don't think we're
Actually,
gonna be
there's
able
some
to-
more sub ones that are Canadian, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. I have 11 that are Canadian when I drill down further.
Okay, I'm gonna put browser for this concept. There is also
Ken, this is something you could probably ask Linda Parisian about as well.
Mhm.
concepts, then
She is our SNOMED expert.
so we're saying it was like roughly 30 plus versus what is showing up in the expansion, 69. This may reasons. So both the reason of the decision about needing to determine if it's a different, it should actually be a different value set entirely. And the testing associated with making sure that how we technically describe it is conducted are both reasons for identifying this as a fix for 2.0 rather than 1.2, which is purely oriented on technical corrections. Is that fair? Is anyone uncomfortable with that conclusions?
That's fair. There's a bunch of additional research I think we need to do on this one.
Okay. So what I'm going to do, because right now I'm putting anything that's kind of in the potential span of 1.2 into triage as we work through it. And anything that's going into 2.0 is going to this bucket awaiting community feedback. So I'm going to change the status to awaiting community feedback so that we know this is essentially our grab list. Knowing that there's a couple kind of action items off of this that we would need to solve for this particular one. I think that that's also going to be linked to, where's the other one? This one that Elliot had brought up, which was also another question of like, do we need a union or intersection value set on vaccine codes? Are we comfortable grouping these together and saying similarly, like, we'll need to be able to test these, we need to be able to evaluate what's actually coming up when we point to this?
I think there'll be similar issues on both of them. So
When we talk about union, whatever you call it, I would like to remind it's the content I read from FHIR standard and regarding the value set and the specific is that all those code values listed in the value set should be unique and not overlapped with each other. And actually, I'm not expert on this matter, so when we talk about it, we need always reference that statement in our discussion.
And if there's like relevant guidance that you wanted to throw into this or that we should evaluate when we're looking through this, Thomas, can you throw it into this ticket? I'll comment my piece, and then if you can add like a link to if there was specific guidance that you want us to.
I will try. I will
Yeah.
find it right now as soon as possible.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Okay. If meaning changes and investigation of impact of creating new using value set include will be evaluating this change as part of 2.0 instead of 1.2. Let folks kind of read basically the pointer to the other issue, summary of the reason why we would need further investigation, and the decision to basically say we'll move this into the icebox for 2.0, as long as it's not preventing us from essentially building correctly and using the baseline without errors or warnings or technical problems. Is anyone uncomfortable with this? Taking the same stance with this one?
And you can copy just paste on the chat, and you can copy paste inside as well. And review just after you review that. Thank you.
Yep. I'm going to just put this. Guidance provided below to assist in investigation once this ticket is okay. Last call before I change the status of this one to the bucket that we're using for evaluation in 2.0. All right. So I'll move that one over. There is, so these two will kind of go together. I think there's some of these that like we don't necessarily have to do as a group because it's like we'll have to go through and make sure there's no duplicates in the ignore warnings file. We've got 2 minutes, so I'm just going to show you guys this ticket and just let
Or
you.
my apology, and I copy paste the wrong one. Please just copy the second one. Just paste the best practice notes. Sorry for that.
And that's the one from that same page.
Yep.
Okay.
Apology.
Okay. All right. Okay, so then I was just going to show you guys this one real quick. Just to let you know, I think it's a technical correction that we can apply. It's not necessarily a decision, but just I thought it would be a helpful one for awareness. So whenever we're utilizing content that's a value set and that's hosted at a different URL than what we have as our canonical base, we often have to like actually identify that in a what's called special URI parameter that's in the implementation guide. So when Elliot was doing his QA, he identified a handful of these that didn't necessarily match that conventional URL that we're using in the guide. That's expected. I think it just means that we missed it when calling out specifically the URLs that we wanted IG Publisher to ignore because we know that they were from a source that was outside of the CA baseline. And so this is one we just want to flag that folks are aware of. We're not necessarily changing the value sets, but we are going to probably put something in place so that our iGuide is aware that, hey, these aren't intended to be published in 1.2 with a canonical URL. It's this that matches. We'll have to reevaluate that in 2.0 if as part of our overall terminology efforts. But that's one is more of just an FYI if you guys are interested in doing that. I was kind of hoping to show how it worked on the call, but we will have to show you guys at a different date. Otherwise, I honestly think that there's only one other one. If there's anyone that wants to take a shot, I'll put it in the link. Basically, we talked quite a bit about socialized extensions. I'll put this in the chat. That's really the only outstanding one that we have. And I flagged it for a profiling call because it can be helpful to just like write the narrative together. But we'll see if it's possible to maybe do a draft of it before we put it forward to you folks on the next profiling call. But it's essentially just this ticket ended in make sure that we have written what we need to write about the fact that the baseline socializes extensions. And that's, I think, the last one on our list for ones that actually kind of we haven't been able to talk about before. The rest of them are just ones that are in the submitted category. I'm pretty sure that these are going to be all things that are squarely in 2.0, but if you want to do a little bit of review ahead of time and let us know if you disagree with any of that, you can go directly to the submitted ones that all kind of fit within that filter. And have a look and let us know if there's any that you want to make sure get into 1.2 that you think are reasonable within scope. Otherwise, I think we'll probably consider a good deal of them 2.0 and evaluate them in the coming profiling calls under that lens. All right, I already took 1 minute over, but we will see many of you next week for the governance call. And again, if you're interested in contributing or putting any comments on these in the meantime, please do. Don't want to stop you. We'll just continue making progress on the application of issues to get 2.0 or 1.2 out the door. All right, thanks, folks.